let's round all the way back and move on to our final segment here. So we, Brett, you are the kind of, I don't know what the right word to use. Like you're like the unofficial / official Kasrkin King running around right now. And you've taken them to, I want to say it was 12th place at KTO and 11th place at LVO. Am I right?
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, and this was with pre-buff Kasrkin, and Kasrkin have now been buffed. So first, we're going to talk about the buffs that they just got, and then we're gonna talk to you about the art of the Kasrkin and what exactly you are doing over there to make them work. So
Right.
I think a lot of people are really curious about that, myself included. So for starters, they're 8 wounds now instead of 7. They've given every model an extra wound. This is super helpful. Secondly, the elite points, they get 2 more per turn. So that and these 2 extra ones are not tied to the leader. So even if your leader dies, you're still getting 2 points. And if your leader's alive, you're getting 4 points per turn. So that's great. And finally, and this is my favorite change, they get access to a 1 equipment point combat blade that is 3 attacks on 4s, 3/4 damage, and it works with 4 Cadia. So, Brett, I'm just going to hand it over to you. You're going to talk to me about these changes and what you think.
Yeah, so first off, that buff was so much more than I really could have hoped for and really thought it would be. So I think when I talk to most people about what I wanted from them, and to be honest, I didn't really think they needed too much. That extra wound was kind of like the main thing that I was after. That feels good. Like you said, that helps with survivability so much. In a game where a lot of the damage profiles are 3/4, being able to survive a crit and a hit from profiles like that was huge. And now you're talking about a leader with 9 wounds as well. And since he was originally the only operative who had any sort of decent melee, that was really good for him. Actually, now he has 9 wounds. He can push up a little bit more. But now we're also talking about they added the combat blade, which is something more than I thought we were going to get. I didn't think we were actually going to get any sort of buff to Kasrkin melee. I assumed we're just going to stick with what I believe is some of the best shooting in the game. Very controversial opinion, I think, from what I've heard online and from other people. But I think it's very good. I did not expect them to get any sort of buff to that. And the fact that it's an equipment, I think, is actually fantastic because a lot of the Kasrkin equipment is pretty lackluster. You have your classic crack and frag, and adrenaline shots are pretty useful here and there. The foregrips, they can be useful on Into the Dark if you want to go on guard, but you're still hitting on 4s. Long-range scopes are only so useful on open boards, and certain models can't even benefit from it. So I think it's fantastic that we got the combat blade. Personally, I'm going to be testing it out some more, but I think that along with being able to stack it with 4 Cadia, that's huge. Now we're talking about being able to push somebody into an enemy doing 4 or 5 damage with your elite points. That's even if you're hitting on 4s, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And you have more
you're almost
elite points.
Right, absolutely. Okay, and that's another thing. So that was huge to me. That blew my mind. Now we get 2 elite points at the beginning of every strategic phase. So now the max for our elite points just increased significantly. And the way that you can play with that now is you can just throw those elite points out.
Yeah, you had to be very cautious with them before, right?
You did. It, depending on what you're playing against, you kind of need to figure out what's your high value target. You get a shot at it. You spend those elite points. You go for the kill. You don't stress about it. Just spend them where you can.
So tell me if I'm wrong. There was, for me, I only played Kasrkin one time ever. I played against them a few times, but I played as them once. And it seemed to me like one skill that you needed to have with this team was being able to identify not when to use your elite points, but more importantly, when not to use them and when to accept a loss as a loss and like a whiff as a whiff. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's if you get a roll, you know, you miss. If you're missing 3 out of 4 shots, you know, if your target is not below half health, especially if you're just using, you know, a hotshot las gun, something like that. If it's not a gunner who's putting out more damage, probably not worth it. You know,
Yeah, it's
unless
tempting,
you have,
but don't do it.
it's tempting. It's very tempting, especially if you have a lot of elite points. You might want to do it. But if you don't have a special rule, like say, you know, the sharpshooter crits doing mortal wounds, you know, it's not necessarily going to be worth it. You know, maybe with your plasma, if you've got it supercharged, especially if you roll a 1, you know, and that's a whole separate thing, right? We can completely get around hot. You know, with Kasrkin, 99% of the time, you should supercharge. You almost have no reason not to. Unless they have a really good invulnerable save, you know, you should do it. But with those extra elite points, though, I mean, that's huge. You can be so much more liberal with them now. As a matter of fact, I was just talking to Blayne about this before. The fact that we get those elite points, the 2 now at the beginning of each strategic phase, I mean, you don't even really have to care too much about your leader anymore. Like, he is just the icing on the cake. If he's alive, now you're getting 4 at the beginning of each turn.
Yeah.
You know, otherwise, if you're not really too concerned about it, you're just pushing another plasma pistol up the board.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you're too aggressive on turn 1 and he gets killed, at the very least, you got 2 more elite points than you did before because you get it on the first turn.
Exactly.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about what you've been doing with them to find success, because a lot of people have clearly been struggling to make Kasrkin work, but you're doing something that is working on a consistent level across different major tournaments against good competition. So, let's start with operative selection a little bit, because that's most kill teams don't have a ton going on in terms of like list building. But what were you like? How do you approach which models you take into certain things? Like, what do you leave out the most? What gunner wise? What are you taking? Like, stuff along those lines.
Sure. So I think we'll start with probably the most obvious. Flamer, pretty much not taking it. You know, it maybe on Into the Dark against teams that are saving on 5s. That's about it, right? But otherwise, you know, the others are all pretty reliable depending on what you're going up against. Typically, the things I pretty much always take going to be plasma, because why not? You know, plasma and Kill Team is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
The grenade launcher, fantastic on Into the Dark and open. You know, that's blast opportunities and all that are fantastic. Good thing to spend elite points on against certain teams. Melta, fantastic against elite teams. Another source of AP2 with the mortals. You know, you need to bump up to a crit. Easy to do it. And then I like to take the hotshot volley gunner a lot too, just because he has the 5 dice in P1. I mean, that's pretty big. If you can land at least 1 crit, that actually just increases my chance of spending elite points, because, you know, if they don't have an invul save that's worth using, you know, that makes it all the more wild. Like, if that's a case where if I miss 3 out of 5, but if I get a crit and a hit, then I'm probably going to spend another one. Like, I'm going to spend points to make sure I get at least another hit.
Yeah.
Something like a situation like that.
So
those are typically the main. The sharpshooter is also very valuable on either Into the Dark if you have long hallways, or I mean on a lot of open boards. He's fantastic, of course, for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So
nice. So is it the? I think I read an article that you that you did at one point where you said that you sometimes you leave the mine guy at home. So what's the usage on that guy? Like, when does he come out?
Yeah, he's typically, you know, your sort of Into the Dark type of operative. I mean, you know, for obvious reasons, he is incredibly useful for locking down hallways. You know, that Meltamine is pretty scary stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And that being said, though, it's it's more a fact of you're taking him against your elite teams or, just teams that are 10 bodies or less. And a lot of the time, I'm taking him and I'm moving him up the board early game, giving him an APL just to get the mine down. After that, if he dies, no big deal. He did his job.
Yeah,
That
because
is
the mine
purely
still
for
goes
security.
off, even if he's
Right,
dead.
the mine will still go off. Yep.
Nice.
And even if somebody decides to charge into it with him there, if you're getting that kill and you're still up on bodies, that's, in my eyes, that's a worthwhile trade.
Cool.
So on an open board, however, it's tricky. You may be against an elite team, just because if you can get on a point further up the board and plant it, I mean, that's a huge nuisance. But that being said, that's pretty much all he's got on an open board. He's got a hotshot las pistol. Otherwise, you're not really using it. So I typically will not take him on there. It's not worthwhile when you can take an extra trooper who gets a free elite point. Even with a hotshot las gun, that's actually pretty useful.
Yeah, and I mean the trooper with a frag grenade against Hordes is almost like a specialist in and of himself. What he's able to do.
Definitely. You combine that with your was it the not elimination, the one where you get an extra elite point within 4 inches of the token, and you combine that with the beginning of the initiative, you can do a lot of damage to a lot of guys.
Yeah, so talk to me about what you're doing TAC wise. So I forget, what archetypes do they have access to?
So they have Seek and Destroy, Security, and Recon.
Okay, all right. Well, Recon and Seek and Destroy.
Options.
They have the good ones.
They do, yes. I will say I don't typically take Security.
Okay, so that doesn't surprise me.
Yep.
Do you usually swap between Seek and Destroy and Recon depending on the matchup, or is there one that you lean towards a little bit more often?
I really do switch between them actually quite frequently. I will say, though, I do like Seek and Destroy a lot against elite teams. And typically that's because I like to put Assassinate Target out on the board. So just because, that way in an elite team, you need all your operatives. So when you're assigning one of them to be killed, when you have decent shooting and you're able to, whittle the other team down and force them to use that guy, it's pretty likely you're at least going to injure him and get the 1 point. So I definitely love taking that one. And then eliminates guards can be okay, not against elite teams really. So that's one you'll take against any Horde team really. Otherwise, Headhunter also good against elites just because they need all their operatives.
Yep.
And then they do have very good faction TAC ops.
Yeah, I've noticed that. That was one of the things I think they really had going for them already. They've got like 2, I think, that are good, at least.
Yeah. Yep. And I like to take their Secure Zone one with that's the token you place down within 4 of an enemy operative. Yes. That's against elite teams. That's a very good one because it's, they need their guys. They're going to have to move up the board and you out-activate them. So if you need to, you just keep your gunners back. You wait till they've done something to compromise themselves, and then you get your heavy shooters in there to clear that point off, and you get somebody on there. It's an easy way to bag at least 1 point at some point, like later on in the game when there's less models on the board. It's not too bad.
Yeah, so it sounds like they're pretty good into elite teams, generally speaking.
Okay.
What exactly? Yeah, so how do you handle the teams with more activations than you, like the Hordes of the Kasrkin and Blooded? I mean, Blayne, you play a lot of Blooded, so I'm sure that you guys have played that matchup against each other plenty of times.
Yeah, we have. I think something that I've I've talked to Blayne about this plenty too. If you get a blast shot, say with the frag grenade or from the grenade launcher, that's against teams like that are squishier, have the higher saves. That is 1 point where I am willing to spend a lot of elite points. If you can guarantee yourself, maybe not guarantee, but if you can at least injure a couple models with 1 shot, that in my mind, that's worth it for spending elite points. And especially now with the current buff, we have more points. You might as well. So that is typically, a big influence in how I'll set up and prepare for those games. I'll look for any sort of blast opportunity.
So
Give him an APL and move him up.
do you think that maybe with the combat knife equipment, some of these horde matchups might add another dimension to how you're able to like deal with some of these teams?
I certainly think it will. I think there's a lot of situations actually where that's going to become very useful. I think, and I haven't gotten to test enough yet with this, but I think against a lot of other teams that just don't have good melee, you're giving yourself a pretty good advantage. And you're probably not going to be putting it on all your guys. I mean, you don't have a reason to do that. But mixing that with Forcadia, you can be very aggressive with really any guy with a combat knife. You just charge them into somebody, and then if you've given them an APL and you're able to get that kill, then you can still shoot. Like you're talking about potentially being able to take off 2 models. If you do that with a gunner, that's going to open up a lot.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Okay, interesting. So are they like? Do you think they're better in Into the Dark than Open?
Personally, I do.
Okay.
I do. Yeah, and I think part of that comes down to their Vox Trooper is, I think he is the best comms in the game. I don't know if you can really dispute that. I don't know. He can give APL to 2 guys anywhere on the board.
Yeah.
That's pretty.
It's like the Scions one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, that's incredibly useful and Into the Dark. That gives you so many opportunities for being able to open doors and move and shoot. Do whatever you do. That's pretty big. And the fact that you can do that on some guys who've already activated, so they have that extra APL for the next turning point, and then that next turning point give out 2 more APL to different guys. Now you've got 4 guys at 3 APL. That gives you a lot of ability to shift your guys where you need to.
Yeah, that's definitely that's a pretty weird thing, because then it's like almost half your team is basically 3 APL for a whole turn, which is really funny. Especially on a team that has 10 bodies, that can probably feel pretty brutal if you're playing against a team that is out activated by Kasrkin. So you mentioned earlier that sometimes the demo mine guy gets dropped for a basic trooper. Is there anybody else that you ever sometimes drop to get an extra basic trooper?
I actually don't. He is typically the guy I'll drop.
Okay.
And the reason being for that is because the only other real options to drop would maybe be your recon trooper. And honestly, that might be it. But then the recon trooper also has that extra. You get an extra scouting option with him.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's beautiful. That's hard to get rid of. And on top of that, the only thing he's missing is he doesn't get the free elite point.
Yep.
And he still has the unlimited range, so he can still shoot. So I think it's worth keeping him. I think it's truthfully just the demo trooper that's kind of a drop.
Yeah, I think the having the 2 scouting options, I think a common play you'll probably see a lot is if you're on open board near a vantage point, you drop the barricade up on the vantage point, and you do the recon dash for your sniper up onto the vantage point because he flies, and then suddenly you have this just like really menacing guy just looking over most of the board.
Absolutely. And then on Into the Dark as well, when there aren't as many options. I mean, then you're talking about being able to potentially dash 2 guys towards some doors, and that right there can be a huge advantage. So
Yeah,
on
some of the
play
doors,
types,
Yeah, I was gonna say some of the doors start 7 inches away from the deployment zone on some of those missions. So getting a couple of guys closer to the doors, I mean, that saves you a whole action of being able to get there, which it adds up. But yeah, so I mean, overall, so you thought that Kasrkin didn't really need a ton before the buffs. do you think that where they are now, like hot take it for me, if you will,
Yeah.
let's say you're throwing them on a tier list and there's like S, A, B, C. Where would you put them now post buff compared to pre buff?
Personally, I would put them at A tier.
Okay.
I don't think they're quite an S tier solely for the fact that they are probably not as well rounded as some other teams. You still need the equipment to have decent melee and that sort of thing. A lot of their equipment is maybe a little lackluster. Just little things like that. I think they're close. Like I said, I do think they have very good shooting. I think people underestimate their shooting. And I do think with the new buff, personally, I think the elite points might have been a little bit too far. I don't know if we needed that.
So
the equipment in the wounds was fantastic.
I'm going to give you a pedestal very quick. I'd like you to deliver a message to all the people that think that Kasrkin should hit on threes. Just tell me what you think about this.
I see that everywhere. Oh my God, the amount of discords and things I've been in where people are talking about that. And listen, I get it. 3-up ballistic skill is pretty nice. I know a 4-up is intimidating. But listen, just roll the dice, see what happens, and if you don't like it, you can just change a die. You have a ploy to essentially give yourself relentless in the right conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these things happen. Just don't worry about it so much. They're a solid team. I know people like their Scions, but
yeah,
try them out.
So do you think Kasrkin are better than Scions?
I feel like I am not educated enough to make that because I haven't really seen enough of Scions. That being said, I understand that Scions were quite popular and they were reliable, but I don't know if it's fair to compare it just because it's a different ability. Elite dice are a weird ability.
They are.
Die manipulation is strange.
Yeah, I personally think they are better than than Scions now after the changes. I think just the extra tools that you get as one of these specialist teams just kind of puts them over the edge. But super interesting. Blayne, can you give us a little bit of wisdom on what it's like playing against skilled Kasrkin? Because there's not a lot of Kasrkin floating around out there, let alone like very good Kasrkin players. So what's it like on the other side?
So most of the games that I've played against Brett, I've played quite a few teams. Mainly Blooded, some Hunter Clade, some RBDs now, like the Exaction Squad. Just a little bit of everything into them. I can definitely tell you that they are way, way, way better against elite teams than the Horde teams. Just because they can focus fire down elites a lot faster. And the way Brett plays them is kind of crazy because he makes them seem like they aren't he made them seem like they didn't need buffs. Like they were a team that kind of like Commandos where they just they're good in the right hands, and in the right hands they are, like he said, an A tier team. Like they didn't really need the buffs, but yeah, it's kind of crazy. And I do see where they suffer a little bit against teams with really, really good melee. Just before this podcast, we had just played a casual game where I was using Harlequins, Void Dancer troop into them, and it kind of just went very one-sided for Void Dancer because of the melee. So like if you can get up in their face and kind of make them play around you, I think that's where Kasrkin can start to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
But like Brett's been taking these high placements at these tournaments, so he's got to be doing something well,
Yeah, Ryan and I actually did a live stream. I want to say like probably 2 months ago. It was before KTO, where he played Kasrkin and I played Void Dancers, and that is a brutal matchup. Let me tell you. I know where you're coming from.
Yeah. So, and like I said, I've been on the other side where I'm playing something like Blooded with, 12 to 14 bodies into Kasrkin, and that's a spot where it becomes a little bit less, or it becomes a little bit more blurry, where like Kasrkin have a lot better shooting than a team like Blooded, or in my opinion, a team like Vetguard, but you just have so many activations that you can kind of like bounce around the Kasrkin and
Hmm.
do a little bit more than they can. Um, and so it makes a player like Brett have to play a lot more strategically, and you kind of can't just throw a trooper in the middle of nowhere, because if you lose a body with Kasrkin, you're already down models on that Horde team. So you have to be a little bit more careful, I feel,
Hmm.
in matchups like that. So
Okay. Very cool.
And I actually would like to add, just like what Blaine said, one thing that Kazarkin has taught me most is positioning is just, it's so important. You lose a guy on Kazarkin, you're down 10% of your team. That adds up really quickly.
Yep.
Same goes for any other team, but
As an
before the
elite
buff,
player, I know what you're talking about.
yeah, exactly. So that was one thing. And that's also why I don't think that they're an S team, because I feel like you probably couldn't just hop into them with no practice and expect to do well. They
Hmm.
don't have as many game breaking things. You're still going to have to be careful. You can't overexpose. You can't rush straight in. Maybe with
Yeah.
4 KDO you can rush straight in, but that's about it.